I'd like to make the introduction of our next guest speaker. Joseph Chara is the Greenwood Cemetery Director of Horticulture and Curator of Plant Collections. He's been at Greenwood since 2015. Joseph is responsible for the Arboretum's living collections, leading its horticulture operations and fostering various initiatives related to the research and collaboration with a range of institutions and agencies. Effectively, he's responsible for over 7,000 trees and shrubs. Joe graduated from the New York Botanical Garden School of Professional Horticulture and holds a master's degree from the New York Botanical Garden, from English Literature from Brooklyn College. Following his master's, a chance meeting with the vice president of the New York Botanical Garden led to his enrollment in the Botanical Garden School of Professional Horticulture, which in turn led him to Greenwood Cemetery. I'd like to bring up Kevin Wyatt, who actually arranged for Joe to be here, and without any further ado, Kevin.
Good morning, everyone. Before we start our presentation, I think it would be important to discuss Greenwood Cemetery and why. Certainly, I believe it's an important place, but for the most part, especially here in Connecticut, you all would be probably saying, well, what's so important about a cemetery in Brooklyn, New York? Well, Greenwood Cemetery is both a unique combination of both natural wonder and architectural beauty, whose grounds are of historical significance, not only for the famous names and contributions of those people that are interred there, but also because of the significant historical events that happen on those very grounds. It is listed as a National Historic Landmark and draws thousands of visitors each year. The location, composition of the landscape, and its history are all important when discussing Greenwood Cemetery. During the Ice Age, During the Ice Age, 2.4 million years ago, ice sheets covered about 2 miles thick, covered most of this section of North America. Its southernmost point was along the Atlantic Ocean in what is now New York City. "10,000 years ago, the last of the glaciers retreated, leaving behind glacial erratics, which are large randomly placed boulders whose composition is different from the local bedrock. And glacial erratics can be found throughout the Northeast, and for some strange reason, people love to be photographed next to them. All right, terminal moraine. Terminal moraine are the large deposits of soil, rocks, and debris that were pushed by the advancing ice sheets, much like a snowplow. And they were piled into large piles of mounds at the ice sheet's furthest points, or their terminal points. Now, this is a view of Manhattan from what is known as Battle Hill at Greenwood Cemetery. Greenwood Cemetery is one of these terminus points where the glaciers or the terminal moraine created these large rolling hills. The western part of the cemetery has rolling hills up to 200 feet tall, which is also the highest point in Brooklyn. It is also a very strategically important location for an overlook of New York Harbor and the East River. The flatlands. The eastern port, beyond the hills, the glacier's melting waters rushed forward towards the ocean, and the land beyond the terminal moraine was basically flattened out in the eastern part of the cemetery. So, if I get the pointer to work. That line delineates where the terminal moraine ends and then the flatlands begin on the eastern part of the cemetery. The eastern portion of the cemetery, which is completely flat, this comes into play when nor'easters or hurricanes strike, because the winds typically are whipping around from the east, and they cross those flatlands and basically slam into these 200-foot hills that have no other cover prior to the winds hitting them. Oh, I'm sorry. Early Brooklyn. As a Dutch colony, what is now Brooklyn was once several small sleeping farming communities and townships. Oops, sorry. In 1646, Dutch settlers settled in what is now what was the town of Brooklyn, in the land of the East River that was inhabited by the Canarsie Indians. In 1664, New Netherlands gets conquered by the British and then becomes New York. And then in 1683, the British mapped out what is currently Kings County and now is known as Brooklyn. Okay, Greenwood's history. On from August 27th to August 30th in 1776, the Battle of Brooklyn took place. Washington's army is defeated there and then makes a daring escape to Manhattan Island. This is also known as the Battle of Long Island or the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, but it was the first formal and largest battle during the Revolutionary War by the number of soldiers, artillery, and naval vessels involved. And this all occurred right on the grounds of what is now Greenwood Cemetery. Now this is a depiction of the battle lines that were formed during the Battle of Brooklyn. Now on Staten Island is where the British forces landed after they came down from Newfoundland and Boston, and they established a base in Staten Island, and their plan was to get to Manhattan, because Manhattan or New York, as it was known then and now, was the focal point of shipping and commerce and everything. So the following is a partial list of some of the people who were involved. It was Admiral Richard Howe and Generals William Howe, Cornwallis, and Clinton. And Cornwallis is famous because he was the general who surrendered at the Battle of Yorktown. On the Patriot side were Generals George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, John Sullivan, Henry Knox, and Connecticut's own General Israel Putnam and Colonel Charles Webb. All took part in what was the largest battle of the Revolutionary War. This is a statue of John Glover. I want to talk to about him for just a minute. John Glover was an American patriot, is elected to be a lieutenant colonel in the Massachusetts Regiment from Marblehead, Massachusetts. He was also the first officer in the Continental Navy. Glover was a privateer who was hired by Washington during the siege of Boston to attack and pillage British supply ships in Boston Harbor. His ship, the Hannah, was named after his wife and was the first ship commissioned in the Continental Navy. The above statue is in Boston, Massachusetts, and in Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx, there's a gigantic glacial erratic known as Glover's Rock. On August 29th, 1776, Washington and his troops are surrounded by General Howe and the British forces. Just want to go back. So this is where he was surrounded. Greenwood Cemetery is located just where it says, just above where it says Brooklyn Heights. So they had British soldiers came from Staten Island. They landed in what's known as Flatlands, Brooklyn, and came through what is known as Jamaica Pass. And in three different prongs were attacking the American forces. The American forces retreated, and then eventually they hunkered down in land which is now the Greenwood Cemetery. On the left is where Admiral Howe, General William Howe's brother, was trying to make his way up the East River to cut off any way of escape. Now, it's important for everyone to realize that if we had lost this battle, the war would have been over right then and there, okay? And we'd probably all be interested in what Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are doing and what's going on with Brexit. We'd speak a little bit differently. Let me go forward again, I'm sorry. Okay. Then, this is the interesting part of the story, is apparently luck was on Washington's side. Washington and Glover devised a plan of escape. Under the cover of darkness, a strong outgoing tide, and dense fog, Washington's army and artillery and horses are ferried across the upper harbor to Manhattan Island to escape. Although he was completely surrounded by overwhelming forces, Washington was, General Howe decided to rest his men for a day before the final assault against Washington and the Patriots' forces. At the same time, a strong northeast wind prevented Admiral Howe's ships from getting up the coastline and sailing further up the East River, and an area which is also known as Spuytenduyvil, to cut off Washington's only escape route. So on the evening of September 29, 1776, the plan went into action. Spuytenduyvil is a body of water located between Manhattan Island and Brooklyn, with wicked currents from the confluence of the Atlantic Ocean, Long Island Sound, and the East River. At times it can turn into what seems to be a cauldron of boiling water. The Dutch named this treacherous piece of water Spuytenduyvil, for as they would say, anyone who would try to cross it would have to do so in spite of the devil. As the night of the escape wore on, a dense fog rolled in over the hillsides, hiding the activity and muffling over the noise. At dawn, when General Howe did attack, all he found were smoldering campfires, and he was known to say, "The sly fox has gone away." Oh. Chris, I don't know why this shut off. Chris? Chris Donnelly? Chris Donnelly? Charlie, can you? Chris? I need help.
Bear to the rescue.
Oh, we're back. All right, so let me fast forward. Thank you very much, Bear. Okay, we're almost there. All right, the sly fox, and these are depictions of George Washington and his escape there. Now, I want to talk briefly about what I call the unsung hero, okay? This gentleman, John Glover. After Washington finally made it to Manhattan Island and crossed over, the British were fuming mad, and they knew that if Washington got off of Manhattan Island, he would eventually make his way up into what is now Westchester, and then all bets were off as far as trying to contain and conquer his army. So the race was on. So the British tried to get him in a pincer, but John Glover delayed the British advancement at the Battle of Pell's Point, slowing down the British, which allowed Washington to move his army off of Manhattan Island and into Westchester. John Glover also was the gentleman who confiscated coal barges that helped Washington cross the Delaware on Christmas Eve in 1777 to surprise the Hessian forces at Trenton for the first victory of the Patriots' forces and the Continental Army. I'd like to take a moment now, before we go any further, to just take a note to talk about Ed Richardson. Ed Richardson, I consider also to be another one of these unsung heroes. After he retired, he went through the state of Connecticut looking for notable trees or historic trees and measured 2,660 different trees throughout the state, chronicled and documented everything about them. So, you know, along with John Glover, there are the Ed Richardsons, and there's probably a few more of us out here in this room that are out here doing a lot of heroic stuff, for the benefit of our country and our communities, and I applaud you all. All right, veteran trees and veteran trees are champion trees. Oh, I gotta go a little further here, sorry. All right. A veteran or legacy or champion tree is defined as a tree which, because of its size, age, or condition, is exceptional in cultural, historical, or natural conservation value. Okay? At Greenwood Cemetery, all the way to your right is Mr. Joe Chara, who is doing a measurement on, I believe it was the national champion Franklin tree. And there's an example of a very hungry London plane tree who's eating one of the headstones. And those are two of Greenwood Cemeteries, and I believe it's New York's two champion sassafras trees that are on the property. Okay, so 1776 wasn't the only battle that took place at Greenwood Cemetery. October 2012, another battle was brewing. Okay. Superstorm Sandy. On October 27, 2012, hundreds of century-old specimen trees are damaged or destroyed. Now, it's important to take into consideration, Greenwood was established in 1838. When they did so, it's 436 acres. When they did so, they incorporated a lot of the original trees, or a lot of the trees that were standing there. So many of these trees were there during the Battle of Brooklyn, which was the birth of really, it was the most major battle in the Revolutionary War, besides obviously Yorktown. Okay, and that's just a couple of pictures of some of the trees that were lost and some of the things that happened there. The fences and monuments can be replaced, but a veteran tree is gone forever. It became apparent that more testing and assessments needed to be done, as a lot of the defects that went unknown before became, clearly apparent. A total of over 300 trees were lost. And the growth rings on one red oak tree that we ended up removing there, at 15 feet in height, was measured at 275 years. So that tree was easily there when the bullets were flying and cannons were blasting in the Battle of Brooklyn. Okay, so after the loss of 300 trees, historic trees and veteran trees, it was decided that we need to do something about this and take a more proactive stand at tree restoration in Greenwood Cemetery. So this is just an example of a tree inventory, because before you're able to do anything, you have to understand what materials you have and what condition they're in. So components of a tree inventory are, species, diameter, height, crown spread, location, health, insect disease presence, maintenance recommendation, and sometimes further let them know if further diagnostic testing will be necessary. There's plenty of software out there for tree inventories these days. A couple of them are Forest Matrix, Tree Plotter, Tree Tracker, iTree, and Arbor Pro. So now that you do the inventory, right, you have to figure out, okay, which trees are the ones that we're going to preserve after losing 300 really historical and wonderful trees. So the first thing is, if you're going to isolate them, how do you formulate a plan on, and what clarifies or what describes a notable tree? So you can do it by the size, diameter, or crown spread. You do it by a species, if it's a rare or uncommon species. Do it by location, its contribution to the landscape. Habitat, is there wildlife or nesting or pollinators using this tree? Does it have historical significance, age, event, or was it planted as a commemorative tree to an event? Okay, so we get to that. Once we get to that point, what's important to do is say, okay, we're gonna make a decision. We're going to save this tree, or we're going to preserve this tree. Well, the first thing to do is figure out is this tree going to be safe. So what you do then is we do a tree risk assessment for the tree. And tree risk assessment, or TRAC as it's known, is an ISA system that can be used to process, identify, and analyze, evaluate tree risk. Some components of that are identify the tree, site conditions to inspect for deficiencies, evaluate and classify the likelihood of failure impacting the target, estimate the potential consequences of a tree failure, determine and recommend advanced assessments if needed, determine tree risk, provide options of treatments or actions to mitigate that risk, and estimate residual risk. And then define follow-up inspections. How often do you need to return and check to see if the tree is in still good condition or still viable? Okay, and that all boils down to one thing: acceptable risk and the tree risk manager. And once again, Mr. Charap is pictured in this photograph here. We were performing a resistograph test on a large red oak that we had suspicions that was mostly hollow after sounding it. A tree risk, the degree of risk, acceptable risk is the degree of risk that is within the tolerance or threshold level of the tree risk manager. In this case, Mr. Joseph Charap. The person or entity responsible for the property's tree management, which once again is Joe. Cost versus benefit analysis. Once the above task has been completed, a licensed or certified arborist should be called to write up a prescription to mitigate risks and improve the overall health and vigor of the trees that you have determined to be preserved. Tree preservation. First you do a tree. So this is basically an outline of how we put together the tree preservation at Greenwood and many other properties that I've worked on in the past. Tree inventory. A tree inventory is a record, location, characteristics, and assessment of individual trees within a defined group. Isolate individual notable trees. Set goals or parameters for defining what a notable or veteran tree is. Perform a tree risk assessment. Tree risk assessment is a systematic process to identify, analyze, and evaluate tree risk. This should be performed by an ISA TRAC certified arborist. So I'm pretty sure a lot of folks here are familiar with the TRAC program, and I highly recommend it for anyone who's in the field. Acceptable risk. The degree of risk that is within the tolerance threshold of the owner, manager, or controlling authority. It's purely objective. What one person or entity believes to be acceptable could be considered unacceptable by somebody else. Okay, so here we are at the end, and I'm going to get ready to hand it off to Joe. But at Greenwood Cemetery, we resolved to have a tree preservation program, and the components are mitigate once you decide that this tree is going to be preserved, you need to mitigate the risks. You need to set up scheduled inspections to reevaluate the tree's condition. It's certainly not a snapshot. You need to return and return and return to see how the tree is doing. And establish a workable budget to assess continuous care and maintenance. And then follow up with regularly scheduled tree maintenance. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody, and I'm going to pass this over to Mr. Joe Chapman.
Hi. I'm just going to get set up. So you might remember me from a few of Kevin's slides. I'm Joe Charup. I'm the Director of Horticulture at Greenwood Cemetery. Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how certain techniques we've used at Greenwood to preserve our veteran canopy. So, as Kevin gave a really great background on Greenwood Cemetery, but I want to provide a little bit more information. Greenwood is a 478-acre active cemetery, accredited arboretum, and National Historic Landmark in Brooklyn, New York. One of the first things many people see when they come to one of our 4 entrances is the sign designating that we are in fact a landmark. And while this is a celebration of all the things that makes Greenwood unique, it really does focus on the landscape itself, and so that's really what I'm here to talk about today. Greenwood's location was essentially chosen because of its natural beauty. It has glacial ponds, wooded areas, rolling hills, but it was also chosen because of its unique geography. It was considered close enough from a day trip from Manhattan, but far enough away that it would never get developed. David Bates Douglas, the landscape architect who designed the cemetery, described it when he visited the first time as a considerable portion of the ground is now covered with fine old forest of native growth, the verdure and shade of which originally suggested the name of the Greenwood. Shade, ruralness, natural beauty, everything in short contrast to the glare, set form, fixed rule, and fashion of the city. So, Greenwood, though, is not alone. Oh, I haven't gone forward in slides. I'm just doing it on my computer. Bear with me a second. That was the historic landmark sign I was talking about last slide. That was the quote I just read. And here we are, caught up. So I'm going to do both. I'm going to press the button here. And Greenwood began during what's called the rural cemetery movement. And for those of you who don't know what this is, and I don't expect a lot of you do, it was at the turn of the 19th century, city planners began moving cemeteries from the inside of cities and the back of churches that were known as graveyards to the outskirts of cities. And this was from concerns over diseases like cholera, overcrowding, and because real estate prices were booming. And these places were really conceived to be places of spiritual uplift. They were thought of places where people could go to appreciate nature and really function as a counterpoint to the urbanization that was going on all around them. The one thing to keep in mind is that these institutions predate botanic gardens, arboreta, and all public parks in this country. They were essentially the first to institutionalize what has since become a quintessential American value that we sort of take for granted now. That all people, even those heathens among us that choose to live in cities, deserve access to green space. These were those first green spaces that this country had. And now that counterpoint to urbanization that I mentioned before is sort of crystallized. The relative ecological value of a site like Greenwood has increased tenfold now that the city around it has become that much more urbanized. That shift has sort of triggered the cemetery to go back to its roots, so to speak, and return to its standing as an important green space for the city. In order to really understand the role that we played within the larger urban ecology, we set out to quantify the benefits of our living collection to better communicate those values to the community at large. So before we talk about the benefits, as Kevin said, Greenwood's tree collection is over 7,000 trees representing 65 genera and on 735 species approximately. The values on the screen were quantified using iTree as part of a management plan that we commissioned from the David Resource Group. And it was great to know these values. They shine a lot of light on the value that the tree collection itself performs, but we know that the heavy lifting of this was done by our mature collection, as the largest proportion of benefits provided by the urban forest are held in the trees greater than 12 inches in diameter. And then we got to be a little concerned about what was going on with our veteran tree collection, because less than 4% of that 7,000 trees are considered veteran or over mature. And as Kevin showed you, our tree collection has been under assault, not only from cataclysmic storms like Superstorm Sandy, sort of a result of climate change. These are some photos from the losses that we did. We lost over 300 trees, and this primarily affected our mature canopy. But we also began seeing a greater incidence of diseases and insects on our grounds. We found southern pine beetle in 2015, and then in 2016 we found oak wilt on our grounds. So we were the first two sites to locate these two diseases in New York, which we're really proud of, but we've since had to understand a little bit more about the threats to our core collections, and oak is one of the defining collections that we have, and we really want to do efforts to preserve it. So I'm going to take a break from that rather uplifting series of slides and talk a little bit about why preservation makes sense at Greenwood. Tree preservation is well within the idea of what Greenwood is. We preserve our city landmark buildings, we preserve our 600,000 monuments with a conservator, and because these trees are critical to our identity, we knew that we had to make a better effort to preserve them on our grounds, specifically our mature canopy. And these trees are part of our shared cultural, spiritual, and heritage as a site itself, but also for the larger United States, as Kevin mentioned. So we began looking for opportunities to further safeguard our collection against what we've been seeing out there. This led to a collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service that we call the CRIPS. When we see a tree that's being threatened by an insect, we prune the tree, remove the wood, and put it into a barrel